Most of the Arrancar in Aizen's army, and by that extension most of the Espada as well, can be characterised by their brutish and animalistic personalities, which sees them driven by instinct to fight and kill their prey in a real display of power. And there are very few exceptions to this rule, making Hueco Mundo a very unstable and chaotic place to be. The notable exceptions include characters like the first Espada Stark, characters like Ulquiorra and Harabel, all of whom are quite reserved and calm-natured. And the character we're going to look at today in this analysis video is perhaps the most emblematic of that change in comparison to the rest of the Arrancar, and that's the former third Espada, Nelliel to Odelschwanck, or Nell for short. Hey everyone, I hope you had a fantastic Christmas and a great new year. It is now 2021, and it's been a little while since my last video, but I hope you're doing really well. I thought we'd kick things off with the character analysis, you know, something familiar, and Nell was the character who was voted for the most by you guys. So by the time this video goes out, there'll probably be a new poll up on the community post page on the channel, so make sure to go check that out if you haven't already, and vote for who you'd like to see in the next character analysis video. But this one's going to be Nell, and I think that's a really interesting one, because out of all of the Arrancar, she feels wholly unique. She's very different from almost every single other character who's a member of this race. And the reason for that is quite simple. She is effectively the good Espada. Of all the Espada characters in the series, she's the only one who aligns herself with the heroes for the entirety of the story. Obviously, Grimmjow swaps sides right at the very end of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, but Nell is the good-natured Espada, the one who really kind of signifies everything that the Espada are not, for the most part. She's compassionate, she's caring, she's kind. For the most part, it seems like she doesn't care for fighting. In that sense, she's defined, in my opinion, by her relationship with the fifth Espada, Nnoitra Jiruga, who is basically the inverse of everything that Nelliel is, much to his annoyance. And I really find their relationship to be quite fascinating. It's obviously something we'll get into in this video. So in this one, we're looking at Nell, the former third Espada. Before we begin, however, guys, if you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, I'd really appreciate the support. We're on the road to 50,000 subs, and if you love Bleach, you're in the perfect place for videos like this every single week, so make sure to hit that button now. Give the video a thumbs up as well, because it really does help with the whole YouTube algorithm and the exposure on the website, and also don't forget to give the notification bell a hit. Just make sure you stay up to date with all of my videos. Like I said a minute ago, Nell is a very interesting character because she is so unique among the Bleach cast. I mean, I don't think there are any other characters that I can think of off the top of my head anyway that go between being like a baby and then a fully grown woman. But Nell is that character, and she first makes an appearance in chapter 245, and then her final appearance is all the way towards the end of the story in chapter 666, along with characters like Kisuke and Grimmjow. I quite like Nell as a character because I feel like she introduces us to a whole new side of Hueco Mundo. You're supposed to go into Hueco Mundo seeing this desolate, barren landscape, this bone-white sand where nothing can grow and nothing can live, and the whole place is this hollow world. And up until this point in Bleach, we really did know the Hollows to be the bad guys. You know, it was quite black and white. Yes, the Gote 13 itself is quite morally ambiguous, but the Espada and the Arrancar really are the bad guys. You know, these guys have to die in every single fight because they are the villains, they work for Aizen. And then you find out that Nell exists, and Ichigo and his friends don't even initially think that she's an Arrancar or a Hollow because of the way she's acting. But I really liked that fresh perspective, and it did actually make Hueco Mundo a little bit more three-dimensional as an area to find out that Nell and her Fraction existed, and they weren't horrible people. You know, they weren't driven entirely by their instinct and their lust to kill and their lust for power. And I really liked that. I thought it was quite an interesting dynamic. And it's cool that Nell does join the group of friends for the duration of the Hueco Mundo invasion arc, at least anyway, because she does unfortunately sort of fall off the face of the earth for a little while anyway. So if we start briefly then by looking at her personality, I do think Nell, like I said a minute ago, is quite an interesting character, and her baby personality is funny. You know, that's the main, she is kind of the comic relief for the most part of the initial stage of the Hueco Mundo invasion arc. And it's funny the way she knows words like masochist that she shouldn't know, and it always surprises Ichigo and the people who are around him that she knows these kind of words. But she does also act as their guide. She knows the Hollow World better than any of them. And she's a good way of increasing the stakes, you know, because Nell kind of comes across as this wholly innocent being, especially when she's a child. And when Ichigo comes up against characters like Dordoni, for instance, who tries to turn the battle against Ichigo by trying to attack Nell and targeting Nell, even with a character like Dordoni, who is interesting in his own right because he has his own moral code and his own kind of honor code, he still tries to attack Nell to force Ichigo's full power out of him. So I like the way Nell is used to not only increase the stakes, especially surrounding Ichigo, because he's a little bit wary about using his powers, but also to highlight how some of the other Hollows, despite their honor codes, are still almost monsters at heart, despite the fact that Dordoni is definitely, even by his own admission, not the worst by a long way. But her personality, for the most part, is light-hearted, it's fun, and she does provide the comic relief for the Hueco Mundo invasion arc. And I also like how she plays off of Orihime as well, especially during the Ichigo versus Grimmjow battle, when Orihime is sort of starting to feel a bit depressed and kind of downbeat by the fact that Ichigo is becoming a monster. Hueco Mundo is turning Ichigo into the very monsters that he's fighting. Nell kind of acts as like a buffer for Orihime. Even as a little child, she does show a wisdom beyond her age. And that's because, of course, she is actually an adult. She is the former third Espada, but she retains most of that personality even in that transformed state, which I think works quite well as well. Again, it's quite funny, seeing how over the top she is about seeing Ichigo all the time, calling him Ichigo as child Nell. For the most part, I like her personality. I think her personality is a little bit more plain back in the day before this all sort of happened to her, and I think Kubo kind of does that on purpose to show how majorly the events that took place in her history did affect her. So, talking about her history, let's move on to Nell's role in the story as a whole. So Ichigo and his friends have invaded Hueco Mundo to try and rescue Orihime, and they're kind of on the outskirts of Las Noches, like they haven't actually made it into the main palace yet, so they're still on the desert sands, and they end up seeing this little girl being chased around by a bunch of Hollows, and it turns out to be Nell being chased by her Fraction Pesce, Dondachaka, and Bawa Bawa. And it turns out, obviously, that, you know, Ichigo and the others kind of misconstrue this as these Hollows are trying to attack a human, but actually they're all friends, they're all Hollows, and they're all playing this game of eternal tag. Immediately telling you that you were wrong about everything that you thought about Hollows. You know, take what you know about Hollows and throw it out the window, because Nell and her friends represent a whole new side to these characters, which, like I said before, I absolutely love. Like, these guys, they have Hollow masks. They should be intimidating and evil, but they're not. They're totally different, and I love that. But Nell essentially works as their guide into Hueco Mundo. She travels with Ichigo, predominantly. He's the one who goes with her. And like I said, they develop quite a nice relationship, actually. This relationship of protector and the one being defended, and how that eventually gets upturned on its head much later on when Nell eventually transforms again. But for the beginning, Ichigo is the one defending her, and I like that. I think it works really well. There's a lot of nice comedic moments here. And we don't get to spend a lot of time with Nell actually hanging out with her Fraction, because they do eventually split apart quite quickly to go with other people. Pesce and Dondachaka end up going with Renji and then Uryu to fight Xylophoro, but that works in and of itself because, and like we'll get into this in a bit, but Kubo does a lot with Nell regarding her backstory and the relationships that come of that, way more than he does with almost every single person in Hueco Mundo, so that's actually quite fascinating. We get to learn just how much Nell comes to care for Ichigo, the guy who's been protecting her this whole time. He's shown her as well how different Shinigami can actually be, which again I really like, because both of these characters have quite a transformative effect on each other's worldviews when you think about it. Nell opens Ichigo's eyes to just a brand new way of looking at Hollows entirely, and that extends to Arrancars as well. But, you know, Ichigo does the same for Nell. Up until this point, Nell's been terrified of Shinigami, and it gives you a really interesting perspective as well as how Shinigami are viewed by some Hollows. You know, a lot of those Arrancar, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, are itching for a fight anyway, and they just hate the Shinigami. But those that maybe aren't itching for a fight are actively terrified of the Shinigami and being killed for just existing. And this is obviously something that the Espada Zomari goes into. But Zomari is a very arrogant character with a lot of hubris, so it's difficult to see past that. With Zomari, it's hard to kind of see the forest for the trees. But with Nell, it's a very pure and innocent terror that she sees when she sees Ichigo and Rukia and Renji. And yeah, it's played up for laughs. Basically everything with baby Nell is. But it is really interesting seeing how they kind of affect each other's worldview like that. I really like that because I think Hueco Mundo arc, in general, it gets a lot of flack for being essentially a rerun of the Soul Society arc. I never agreed with that. I think it's supposed to be an inverse of that arc. It is supposed to be like that thematically. The characters represent that a lot of the time as well, and I really think you're supposed to get both sides of the story through Ichigo and Nell's relationship, because most of the Espada are fight-hungry, animals, essentially, whereas Nell's not. So I think that's really interesting. But moving on, we get to see how much he cares for Ichigo when he gets defeated by Ulquiorra and it looks like he might be dead, when he's getting beaten up by Grimmjow and Nell is the one who leads the rallying cry to help Ichigo come back and win the fight. But things really start to heat up for Nell as a character once Grimmjow is defeated. So Grimmjow's beaten, and then Nnoitra comes in, the 5th Espada, and attacks Grimmjow and then fights Ichigo because he fights dirty. This guy, Nnoitra, has no morals whatsoever, no kind of ethics code. And that's crucial, of course, to his relationship with Nell. Nnoitra just cares about being viewed as the strongest, and if that means crushing weak ants who couldn't fight back, then so be it. But Nnoitra does beat up Ichigo, essentially, and he gets his Fraction to beat him up as well. But this causes a transformation to trigger in Nelliel, and she becomes the grown woman version of the character. And it's interesting as well because Pesce and Dondachaka are some way away kind of fighting Xyloporo, and they know that something bad is about to happen regarding Nell. They know she's about to change. She's getting taken closer to the heart of Las Noches, they say. They expect something bad to happen. They're basically anticipating her running into something that might trigger the memories coming back to her of what happened in the past. Now, in my opinion, part of what helped make Nell so popular and so memorable among fans was the surprisingly in-depth backstory Kubo actually afforded her regarding her relationship with the 5th Espada Nnoitra. And it is actually really good stuff. As far as Arrancar backstory goes, it is probably the best one. I think it kind of reminds me a little bit of how in-depth the friend backstory goes with Hashwath and Basby much later on. And obviously Grimmjow gets a good backstory, but it's quite insular, whereas this one does encompass more of Hueco Mundo, I think. But basically, Nelliel used to be the former 3rd Espada, back when Nnoitra was the 8th Espada, and characters like Xyloporo weren't even members of the Espada at this point. And Nnoitra just hates the way Nell acts. Essentially, everything is born out of this burgeoning feeling of sexism that Nnoitra has towards Nelliel. He hates the fact that she's a higher rank than him because she's a female. We know he's very chauvinistic already. He has a go at Harabel during the Espada table meeting. He doesn't speak up to anyone else. And he doesn't seem, at least on the surface, to have a problem with the fact that there are, 3 male Espadas ranked higher than him, but he focuses in on Nelliel and Harabel. But that's an interesting character trait for Nnoitra, but it does create this antagonistic relationship between him and Nell. And already you see, even back in the past, that Nell was very, very different to other members of the Espada. Although she followed Aizen's orders to the letter, she was more reserved, more seemingly intelligent at least, and she wasn't particularly into fighting, at least it appears anyway, whereas Nnoitra is the complete opposite of everything that she is. He wants to fight, he wants to kill and prove his strength, almost meaninglessly. It feels very arbitrary, but I think that's kind of the point Kubo's trying to get across here. But naturally they are going to come to blows in the past, and they do. Nnoitra constantly tries to fight Nell, but she turns him down every step of the way, basically saying that, she doesn't want to fight him, it's meaningless. And it is interesting because although Nell does strive to appear to be above all of this, it does kind of feel like she also provokes him a little bit as well when he says, why do you keep following me then? And she basically well, because you're weaker than me. And that's obviously going to rile him up. But it does seem like they were always kind of destined to clash and things were going to get ugly in the future. And things do, unfortunately, get pretty ugly. Nnoitra ends up teaming up with Szayelaporro to use his new technology to help defeat Nel, when basically everything else has failed. Nnoitra rips off the masks of Pesce and Donderchaka forcibly, which is actually quite gruesome when you think about it. And Nel tries to attack him, but she's tricked by a hologram that Szayel creates, and then Nnoitra is able to get a sucker punch on her, which causes a crack to appear in her hollow mask, and she falls unconscious, at which point Nnoitra throws her out of Las Noches. And it's really interesting. I think this is, again, like I said a minute ago, one of the probably the best backstories in Bleach, because it is quite a tragic tale about how this guy who, was never satisfied and just wanted to tear someone down from their perch. Very hollow-like of Nnoitra. Nnoitra is very emblematic of what it means to be a hollow, but also what it means to be an Arrancar. Like, he is a hollow who has gained intelligence and power by becoming an Arrancar, by having his mask broken and gaining this new power. But at the same time, he's retained that animalistic desire to be the strongest, which makes him quite dangerous. And he ends up teaming up with Szayel, who's kind of like a bit of a glory grabber back here, who just kind of, I think, probably just wants to get his way back into the Espada. I think Nnoitra mentions he's been demoted, and with Nel being removed from the Espada, there's a vacancy and whatnot, but they end up teaming up together. And I loved how this was almost replicated in the modern day. Pesce and Donderchaka fight Szayelaporro, Nel fights Nnoitra. And, Szayelaporro even recognises the two of them as well, which I thought was really cool. But so we do find out Nel's backstory. She's removed forcibly from Las Noches, thrown out onto the sands, where she turns into a child because, as Szayel theorises, she's leaking Reiatsu from the wound on her head, which has turned her into essentially a baby. Again, really weird. It never happens to anyone else, but then you never really see that sort of injury again, I don't think. And I thought it was a pretty fascinating character turn. I liked the backstory. I thought it was really well done. It gave us a reason to root for Nelliel and to root for people who are fighting Nnoitra, which was more than most Espada got. I think people tend to look at the Espada with rose-tinted glasses a little bit in regards to how much character development these characters actually got. It wasn't a lot. It really wasn't a lot. Most of them didn't get anything at all. At least half of the Espada, and there's only 10 of them, got no backstory whatsoever. So Nel, Nnoitra, and to a lesser extent Szayelaporro getting all of this intertwined story is actually really nice. But in the modern day, the roles have now been reversed. Nel is now the one protecting Ichigo from Nnoitra, who has been beating him up. Ichigo obviously hasn't had a chance to heal or rest up or anything, and that's exactly how Nnoitra likes it. He sees Ichigo as his prey, and now it's time for Nelliel to stand up and fight for him this time. And again, I love this whole role reversal, this whole flipping of the switch that happens between these two characters. Ichigo's the protector, now Nelliel is, and they both, like I said a minute ago, see different sides of their respective races as well. And it does sort of feel like that Nel is like protecting Ichigo from the worst of Hueco Mundo at this point. And this, obviously, you have to remember, the fight with Nnoitra is just before the end of the Hueco Mundo arc. It then moves on to Fate Karakura Town. So in that sense, it does feel like Nnoitra is supposed to represent the worst of hollow urges, and almost kind of the deviousness that actually goes on within the walls of Las Noches. Like, as a setting, I think it's kind of underrated. I love the way Aizen kind of swoops in, and this is something I mentioned in my Baragon video. Aizen kind of swoops in, makes a bunch of changes, whether they like it or not. He installs the dome of Las Noches, which gives this idea of like a fake perfect sunlight, very unhollow. Most of them would probably rather just live in the dark. But yeah, it's really fascinating regardless. And Nel fights Nnoitra, absolutely annihilates him. She activates her Resurrection Gamuza, and then uses Lanzador Verde to basically smash Nnoitra with this massive spear. And it sends him flying backwards. It breaks a bit of his blade, but it doesn't actually do much damage to him. He then uses the Cero on her, and Nel uses her ability Cero Doble, where she basically eats someone else's Cero and then fires it back at them. And although Nel does have definitely the upper hand on Nnoitra here, I personally attribute that a lot to the surprise factor of her just transforming all of a sudden. I don't actually think she would have won that fight if it had carried on all the way. As Nnoitra says to her, things have changed since she left. She's been gone a long time at this point. and he has become considerably more powerful now. So while I think she does get the drop on him here, I don't think she would have won that fight if it had carried on to its climax, essentially. I think Nnoitra probably would have defeated her, especially using his resurrection. But the fight does not get to finish, because as it comes close to looking like Nell's going to actually lay the finishing blow on Nnoitra, although she claims she won't kill him, I assume she's planning on knocking him out, she reverts immediately back to a baby again. No real explanation for it. There's no real explanation for how she transforms back into a woman either, but I would assume, basically, she transforms into a woman because she's not happy with seeing Ichigo getting beaten up, but then the Ryatsu is still technically leaking out of her head, so that's why she turns back into a baby. Either way, it doesn't matter, because Nnoitra starts kicking her around, and then obviously Kenpachi arrives to kind of save the day, and you basically don't see Nell again after that. She does appear in the chapter Omakes. I believe she kind of knocked out, and then she sees like Kenpachi staring at her, and then she gets healed up. But you basically don't find out what happens to her. There is a really nice moment where Kenpachi kills Nnoitra, and it's pretty much the last time you see Nell in the canon manga for this entire arc, when Nnoitra falls to the ground and they lock eyes, and it is the end of their relationship. I do kind of feel like, considering the amount of emphasis, the uncharacteristic amount of emphasis Kubo places on their relationship, I'm surprised that Nell wasn't allowed to finish the fight, and she barely fights when you think about it, considering the amount of time. Kenpachi versus Nnoitra is probably about 8 chapters long. It's quite a long fight, but Kenpachi is this nobody character, essentially. He means absolutely nothing to Nnoitra or to Nell or to anyone like that. He just comes out of nowhere to save Ichigo. And obviously I know the rest of the captains are doing the same thing, but I really feel like Nell maybe should have at least been able to fight longer. I think she fights Nnoitra maybe for 2 chapters and then just instantly turns back to a baby. And I get what Kubo is doing, bringing the Gotei in to help rescue Ichigo and his friends when they previously said they wouldn't, but I'm just saying, considering the emphasis placed on the relationship between Nelliel and Nnoitra, it feels like she doesn't get her justice, and it also feels like he doesn't get any satisfaction from their rematch, so it's a bit weird that nothing kind of happens a bit more with that. Nell essentially just feels like she gets forgotten about until the very end when Nnoitra collapses to the ground. And it is nice as well that he mentions to her that he wants to die fighting on his feet. This is back in the past. He says that he wants to just fight and prove he's the strongest, and then when he dies, he wants to die before he hits the ground, and that's what happens. And that's he and Nell's kind of last interaction, is them kind of looking at each other. So I did like that. I just felt it was kind of weird that they weren't allowed to fight it out a bit more. Maybe just let Nell get the win over him, because it's not like Kenpachi doesn't have more fights, whereas Nell doesn't really have any fights in the series, which is also kind of weird. But that's it, really, as far as Nell's contribution in the Hueco Mundo arc, which is by far her most prominent moment in the story. She does appear considerably later on, and I mean considerably later. We're talking over 200 chapters, I think. But basically, at the very start of the 1,000 Year Blood War arc, Ichigo is patrolling Karakura Town, and Nell, as a baby, just drops out of the sky and lands on Ichigo, and basically warns him that the Quincy have invaded Hueco Mundo and are now subjugating the Arrancar. And I like this. It's very, very random. It does kind of feel like Kubo maybe forgot Nell and then was like, how do I bring her back into the story? But I actually don't mind it. I like that she's the liaison between Ichigo and Hueco Mundo, and I like that she's kind of the thread that ties the arcs together. Even if it does feel a little bit random, I still think it works because, as I mentioned earlier, Neliel is the emotional core of Hueco Mundo. Without Neliel, it's difficult to care about a lot of the characters. And when I say care, I mean emotionally. A lot of the Arrancar are very cool, but as I said before, they're all basically villains. Most of them are dead. Neliel, however, is the emotional core of Hueco Mundo, and seeing her arrive, seeing her in tears, pleading with Ichigo to help her, you know that something really bad has happened, and I think it's really effective at actually creating this feeling of dread. And considering Child Nell is almost exclusively used for comedic moments, and there is a funny moment here when she super headbutts Ichigo, but then it's very quickly, actually this isn't a funny moment, something bad is going on, so I like that. There's a nice bit of an almost nostalgia hit when she travels back to Hueco Mundo with Ichigo and Pesce to try and find Donderchaka, who has been rounded up by the Vandenreich. But while Nell observes a little bit of the battle with Kurge OP, she is again kind of just forgotten about for ages, which is unfortunate for her. She definitely does seem to just get lost in the sands of Hueco Mundo and then never seen for chapters on end. But she's not seen again until right towards the end of the story, when Ichigo and his friends are trying to infiltrate Varvelt, the Quincy's final stronghold. And then it turns out that Nelliel is part of a task force, essentially, working with Urahara, Yoruichi, Ruruka, Yukio, and Grimmjow to kind of help lead the battle against the Sternritter at the very end. And Nell has a nice couple of clashes with Grimmjow, which again I really like, because one of the things about Nell, especially this far into the story, Aizen is gone, most of the Espada are gone, Harabel is now the queen of Hueco Mundo, but Nelliel is also, she's essentially an advisor. Like I said, she's very composed, she's intelligent, she's calm-natured, she's exactly the kind of leadership Hueco Mundo actually needs to get it through a new era. And Grimmjow feels like a relic of a time gone by. So their new relationship is quite a testy one. It reminds me a little bit of the relationship she had with Nnoitra, and I wonder if maybe she feels the same way, because Grimmjow's always looking to pick a fight. He doesn't have quite the same grudge with her that Nnoitra did, but I do quite like that Nelliel is now this in this position of authority, and Grimmjow wants to question that sometimes, but I think it's pretty good. I especially like the moment when Nell says, I'm 3, you're 6, let's see who wins, and Grimmjow's like, ranks don't mean anything anymore, Aizen's not around, which is the same thing Araniero says to Xyloporo in Hell, which is kind of cool. So I like the way that the ranks do, just at least as far as the Espada go, are mostly superficial just to keep Aizen happy. I think that works, but obviously when the ranks suit them, the Espada like them, so I like that as well. But it turns out she can now basically function as adult Nell the entire time, thanks to this strange wristband device that Kisuke has made her. There's a couple of funny moments here with Orihime as well. It's definitely sort of hinted at that Orihime is jealous of Nell during this story, because, she thinks maybe Nell likes Ichigo like Orihime does, and Nell's very full on, especially with Ichigo. They have this relationship, but you have to remember as well that Nell has some remnants of the personality of a child, so she does appear very excitable and very full on, which does seem to kind of rub Orihime the wrong way, which is played up for laughs a couple of times. But they move on into Varvelt, and Nell is not really seen. And it's a shame. Kubo just doesn't want to do anything with this character for some reason, but they all kind of move on towards where Askin is waiting for them, and then eventually, once the fight with Askin has taken a turn for the worst, and Kisuke and his Bankai are crumbling and Grimmjow is collapsing to the ground thanks to Askin's last-ditch effort to poison them, it's discovered that Nelliel is waiting outside his poison dome, ready to move in and rescue them all from certain death, essentially, and that was one of Urahara's contingency plans, and that's what Nelliel's apparently there for. And she says that she wishes she was able to meet up with Ichigo again, but she has a job to do. And the last time we ever see Nell in the manga, she is blasting towards the Gift Bereich to rescue her friends. And I have mentioned on this channel before that chapter 666 doesn't sit well with me, just because I don't mind that chapter, I just wish that we got closure for those characters after that, but Nelliel does appear in Can't Fear Your Own World, so, if you consider Can't Fear Your Own World canon, she survives along with everyone else. I think it's probably likely she survived anyway. In fact, I think Nell is the only reason you would think these characters survive, because Urahara does have this contingency in place, and she does get in there, and she does rescue them, but that's the only time you see her in the canon manga. After that, she is gone, unfortunately. So that's it for Nell's story in the canon manga, which is what this video is going to cover. She does have a spotty track record as far as appearances go, and she really is one of the characters that suffers the absolute most from just massive periods of not being around, of Kubo maybe forgetting about her or just having nothing for her to do as the battlefield shifts away from Hueco Mundo. So that's a shame, but while she's around, I think Nell makes an impact, and I think that's why she's so enduringly popular among fans, that and the fact that she is wholly unique as far as Arrancar go. She actually boasts quite a few interesting and unique abilities, however, that most Espada and Arrancar don't seem to have. She has a healing saliva which she uses on Ichigo and Dordoni to help keep them alive after their fight, which again is played up mostly for laughs. And then she also has her Cerro Doble ability, which she uses both as Child Nell and Adult Nell, which is, again, a pretty cool power that it doesn't seem like any other Espada can actually do. She eats a Cerro and then she fires it back. I wonder if it has to be a Cerro, or if she can do it with any beam or energy-based attack. I would assume it has to be a Cero because it's called Cero Doble. But it's a cool ability all the same, and her Resurrection Gamuza, I like it, it's unique. But its overall power level, I think, is debatable because, as Nnoitra says, times have changed since she was last actually a member of the Espada. And her Resurrection doesn't actually look all that impressive, I don't think, because her Lanzador Verde doesn't actually seem to injure Nnoitra at all. So the jury's out on actually how powerful she is in her resurrection. Regarding her relationships, I think definitely the most impactful one has to go to Nnoitra, the 5th Espada. They are, again, two sides of the same coin. Nelliel is the representation of the more human side of the Arrancar, that side that they are desperately trying to achieve by breaking their masks and gaining this new power. She's insightful, she's smart, she's calm, reserved, especially in the past, whereas Nnoitra is the opposite of that, and he is very much the relic of how the Hollows used to be. Aggressive, constantly domineering, wanting power. He's even sexist, he doesn't like the fact that women are considered to be more powerful than him among the ranks of the Espada, and that leads them to constantly be at each other's throats, but Nelliel is very much just ignoring his want for battle, and he hates that, and that leads to, tragedy for Nelliel, essentially. And in fact, Noitra's relationship with Nell reminds me a lot of Loli's views on Orihime. Loli sees this person come in who she believes is above her. She has this real inferiority complex about Orihime and Orihime's new place within the world of Hueco Mundo, and she hates that, and she wants nothing more than to just tear her down, tear everything down that Orihime believes in and everything that she stands for. And Noitra's very much the same with Nelliel. They've got this artificial belief that they are living in the other's shadow for whatever preconceived reasoning, and they just want to tear the other one down. So I think that's really interesting. Nnoitra is very much everything a Hollow should be, and, Nelliel is everything a Hollow could be, essentially. And Nell herself is very, very emblematic of the change that Hueco Mundo undergoes. Becomes more civil under the rule of Haribel and Nelliel, and I think that I would have loved to have seen more of that. And I think that's one thing that, if you do think Can't Fear Your Own World is canon, does really well, is show a little bit more of Hueco Mundo post the battle with Aizen. But I think Kubo I think there was a lot of opportunity there for real development of the setting itself and the people who live there. The monsters like Nnoitra are mostly gone, and Haribel and Nelliel are now in charge, and there's a real chance for change there. And I think Nell is, like I said a minute ago, very representative of that change. And her relationship with her Fraction, Pesce and Donda Chaka is quite different to almost every other Espada and their Fraction. She sees them as family, almost like brothers to her. There's a real love and compassion between them, which most Espada don't have for their Fraction. And Nnoitra, again, is designed to be the exact opposite of this, treating Tesla like rubbish most of the time. If Tesla dares to try and show compassion for Nnoitra, he'll respond by attacking him or pointing his blade at his throat or throwing Tesla across the battlefield. Nnoitra doesn't want to show compassion for anyone, even when Tesla definitely cares about him. Nelliel and her Fraction, again, they're like family, and after their masks are forcibly ripped off by Nnoitra, Nelliel shows an uncharacteristic rage and attacks him, clearly falling for the provocation that Nnoitra and Xylopora have set up for her, wanting to turn her into them, essentially, which I find to be interesting. But once Nelliel is thrown out of Las Noches, they do decide to protect her forevermore now that she's become this child, until maybe she can return to her former self. But regardless, they will look out for her. Very uncharacteristic for Hollows, but that's exactly what Nell is. She represents everything that we didn't necessarily think Hollows could be, but they can be. And she does represent the future of Hueco Mundo as well in that regard. But that's it for our video on Nelliel to Odelschwanck, the former 3rd Espada of Aizen's army. The good Espada, the good-natured Espada, the one who really is in many ways above so many others in the Espada, but at the same time, that invited, fury, it invited jealousy and rage, and she was torn down. And I think Nelliel is such an interesting, almost tragic character in many ways, because she is an example of when the bad guys win. She is actually torn down from her post. Really, it feels like she hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe she does tease and provoke Nnoitra a little bit, but she is ripped down from her position and cast out, and I do find that interesting. And obviously the new Hueco Mundo of the future has a place for her there. So that's it for my video on Nelliel. I hope you enjoyed it. I do find her to be an interesting character because she is so different from just about every other member of the Hollow race in Bleach. But let me know what you think of Nell in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think of this character. Do you like Nell as a character? Do you wish that maybe she had been given the chance to defeat Nnoitra properly in the story? Let me know. I'd love to hear what you think. But until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.